In the annals of American history, few figures loom as large or as contradictory as Winfield Scott, a colossus of military strategy, a man whose very name struck fear into the hearts of his enemies, and yet a political outsider whose ambitions were never fully realized. His story is one of triumph and tragedy, of a soldier who shaped a nation but was never fully embraced by it. This is the story of the man they called Old Fuss and Feathers. Born in 1786 in Virginia, Winfield Scott entered a young United States still finding its footing. The Revolution was fresh in memory, and the nation hungered for heroes. Scott, tall and imposing even in his youth, seemed destined for greatness. But destiny is never a straight path. At just 25 years old, Scott's military career nearly ended before it began. In 1812, as war with Britain erupted, he was captured in the disastrous Battle of Queenston Heights. But captivity didn't break him, it forged him. Exchanged in a prisoner swap, Scott returned with a burning determination. He would never again be on the losing side. What followed was a meteoric rise. Scott became obsessed with discipline, with precision. While other officers relied on raw courage, he believed in preparation. His men drilled relentlessly, their movements sharp, their formations unbreakable. By the time of the Battle of Chippewa in 1814, his brigade was the finest in the army, a fact they proved in blood and fire. Under a burning July sun, Scott led his men against British regulars, veterans of the Napoleonic Wars. The fighting was brutal, close enough to see the enemy's eyes. But when the smoke cleared, it was Scott's troops who stood victorious. For the first time in the war, American soldiers had beaten the British in open battle. And at the center of it all, a young colonel whose name would soon echo across the nation. But war is a fickle teacher. For every triumph, there is loss. And for Winfield Scott, the lessons were only beginning. Victory at Chippewa had made Winfield Scott a hero. But heroes in war are never allowed to rest. The flames of conflict still raged, and Scott would soon face his greatest test yet, one that would cement his legend and nearly destroy him. The British were dug in at Lundy's Lane, a strategic crossroads near Niagara Falls. Their forces were seasoned, their positions strong, and yet, as twilight fell on July 25, 1814, Scott gave the order to attack. What followed was one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Muskets flashed in the darkness, bayonets clashed, and the air itself seemed to scream. Scott, ever at the front, led charge after charge, until a bullet tore through his shoulder. Another shattered his collarbone. Collapsing in agony, he was dragged from the field, his uniform soaked in blood. The battle ended in a draw. But for Scott, the pain was only beginning. His wounds were severe, recovery would take months, and yet, even as his body healed, his mind churned. He had seen the cost of war, not just in broken bones, but in broken men, and he vowed to never again lead soldiers into such slaughter without a plan. When peace finally came in 1815, Scott emerged as America's most celebrated young general. But the nation was changing, the age of unchecked aggression was fading, and Scott, ever the student of war, knew that the next conflict would demand more than bravery. It would demand genius. In the years that followed, Scott rewrote the rules of the U.S. Army. His manuals became gospel, his training methods legendary. He demanded perfection, earning him the nickname Old Fuss and Feathers from men who both respected and feared him. To some, he was a tyrant. To others, the only man who could save them from the chaos of war. But one thing was certain: Winfield Scott was preparing for something greater. And when the next war came, when the fate of a continent hung in the balance, he would be ready. That war would come sooner than anyone expected, and it would force Scott to make a choice between duty and conscience, between victory and honor. By 1846, Winfield Scott had spent 3 decades preparing for war, but nothing could have prepared him for what awaited in Mexico, a campaign that would make him immortal and leave him forever haunted. President Polk wanted a quick war, a cheap war, but Scott knew better. To defeat Mexico, he would need to do what no American general had ever attempted: march an army 260 miles into the heart of enemy territory. through deserts, over mountains, and into the teeth of defenses that had stood for centuries. The landing at Veracruz was a masterpiece of planning. 10,000 men, dozens of ships, and not a single life lost. But as Scott's forces pushed inland, the real horror began. Yellow fever ripped through the ranks, supply lines stretched to the breaking point, and waiting in the jagged mountain passes, the entire Mexican army, commanded by none other than General Santa Anna himself. At Cerro Gordo, Santa Anna had set a trap. His cannons dominated the high ground. His infantry outnumbered Scott's 2-1. The road ahead was a slaughterhouse waiting to be filled. And then, Scott did the impossible. He outthought them. While Santa Anna's eyes were fixed on the main road, Scott sent an entire brigade scrambling through ravines no army should have been able to cross. At dawn, when the attack came, it came from where the Mexicans least expected, their own flank. The battle was over by noon. Santa Anna fled so quickly, he left behind his wooden leg. But for Scott, each victory came with a cost. His men were starving, his officers were scheming against him, and with every mile closer to Mexico City, the fighting grew more brutal. At Chapultepec Castle, teenage military cadets, some as young as 13, fought to the last bullet. When the walls were breached, they wrapped themselves in the Mexican flag and jumped from the ramparts rather than be taken. Even Scott, the hardened veteran, was said to have wept at the sight. On September 14, 1847, the American flag rose over Mexico City. Scott had done it. He'd conquered a capital no foreign army had ever taken. But as he walked those conquered streets, past the bodies and the burning buildings, a terrible realization set in. No one back home wanted the man who'd won the war, only the war itself. Mexico City should have been Winfield Scott's crowning glory. Instead, it became the beginning of his end. While Scott was still administering a conquered Mexico, President Polk, the same man who had sent him to war, ordered him home. The official reason? Disciplinary concerns? The truth? Polk feared his general had grown too powerful, too popular, too dangerous. The whispers had started even before the war ended, that Scott was arrogant, that he courted the press too openly, that he harbored ambitions. And in Washington, where paranoia was the national pastime, ambition was the one sin that could never be forgiven. The public adored him. Congress gave him a gold medal. But behind closed doors, the knives were out. Even his own subordinate, Gideon Pillow, a man whose incompetence in Mexico had nearly cost lives, was now poisoning Polk's ear against him. A court of inquiry was convened. The charges, misconduct, the real crime, refusing to play politics. When the smoke cleared, Scott was exonerated, but the damage was done. His reputation had been tarnished, and worse, he had learned a hard lesson. No matter how brilliantly you serve your country, loyalty flows only one way. And so, in 1852, Winfield Scott did the one thing he had always denied wanting. He ran for president. It was a disaster from the start. The Whig Party was fracturing. The slavery issue was tearing the nation apart. And Scott, never a natural politician, found himself trapped between factions, his every word twisted. He spoke of unity, of honor, of a nation greater than its divisions, and America wasn't listening. He lost in a landslide, carried only 4 states. The papers called it a humiliation. But perhaps the cruelest cut, the man who had conquered Mexico couldn't even win Virginia, his own home. 9 years later, the nation he had tried to unite would tear itself apart, and Winfield Scott, old and aching, would be called upon one last time to save it. April 1861. The Union was crumbling. State after state had peeled away like rotten timber, and now the cannons at Fort Sumter had spoken. War had come, and in a room choked with the smoke of panic and indecision, one question hung in the air. What now? Winfield Scott was 74 years old. His body was failing him, swollen with dropsy, racked with pain. He could no longer mount a horse without assistance, but his mind was still the sharpest weapon in America's arsenal. And so he proposed a plan, not a reckless charge, not a glorious battle, but a siege, a slow, inexorable strangulation, blockade the ports, control the rivers, squeeze the rebellion until it gasped for air. It was brilliant, it was visionary, and to the young, impatient generals chafing for action, it was cowardice. They mocked him, called him the Anaconda to his face, demanded a quick march to Richmond, promises of victory by Christmas. Scott listened, and then In a voice like grinding stone, he gave them a prophecy. He was right. Of course he was right. But vision has never been valued in the moment. By November, Scott was forced to resign. The old lion was put out to pasture, his plan shelved for now. Yet wars are not won by pride. By 1863, the blockade had crippled the South. The Mississippi had fallen. The Anaconda was doing its work. But the man who conceived it was already fading into history. He lived just long enough to see the Union preserved, to see his vindication, but not long enough to see the America he had served for so long heal its wounds. Winfield Scott had fought his last battle, and this time there would be no comeback. Winfield Scott was gone, the cannons had fallen silent, and yet his shadow stretched further than anyone could have imagined. His manuals remained the Bible of military science. His campaigns were studied as masterclasses in strategy. Even his enemies, those who had mocked him, betrayed him, now whispered his name with reluctant reverence. The Civil War had been won not by reckless charges, but by the very principles Scott had preached: preparation, patience, the relentless pressure of logistics over glory. The Anaconda, once ridiculed, had become doctrine. Even Lee, who had once served under him in Mexico, understood what had been lost. The greatest soldier of his age, he called Scott, a compliment and an epitaph. But history is never simple. For all his genius, Scott's legacy was, like the man himself, a tangle of contradictions. The same man who wept for Mexican cadets had enforced the Trail of Tears. The strategist who saved the Union had also paved the way for its bloodiest war. Hero and villain, victor and victim, all depending on who told the story. Perhaps that was the true lesson of his life, that no man, no matter how brilliant, emerges from war unstained, that every victory leaves someone else to count the dead. Today, Winfield Scott sleeps at West Point, surrounded by the sons and daughters of the army he helped build. His name graces forts and towns. His tactics are taught in war colleges across the world. And though the man has faded into legend, one truth remains: America was shaped, for better and worse, by the mind and will of Old Fuss and Feathers. If you've walked away from this story with even a fraction of the complexity this man deserves, then we've done our job. The past is never simple, but it's always worth unfolding.